Good evening, my friends. Before we begin, I want to know something. Tell me where you are watching this from tonight. Because in the next few minutes, I'm taking you far away. To a place where the ground bleeds red dust, where silence is louder than machines, and where the wind carries the echo of a rising continent. It's the heart of the Sahel, Burkina Faso, a land once forgotten by the world, now standing at the center of a storm that has divided its conscience. And at the center of that storm stands one man, Ibrahim Traoré. The world did not expect him, a young soldier, barely in his 30s, born in the dry heat of West Africa, now holding the weight of an entire continent's hope on his shoulders. He does not march with an army behind him. He carries something heavier: conviction. When he first appeared before his people, there was no grand stage, no polished speech. Just a man in a simple uniform, dust clinging to his boots, his voice steady and unshaken as he said, "Our gold, our soil, our future, they belong to us." Those words moved like wildfire across the plains. They reached farmers in remote villages, students in crowded dormitories, traders in noisy markets, and elders who had long stopped believing that dignity could return. They called him Baba Sovereignty, the father of self-rule. Across the world, leaders paused. In glass towers thousands of miles away, analysts marked his name in red ink, a risk, a disruption, a problem. But in Africa's quiet streets, his name became a prayer whispered beneath the stars. Because for the first time in decades, a leader had stood and said what others feared to say, that recognition should rise from within, not be granted from abroad. In the capital, Ouagadougou, change began with the quiet turning of paper. Contracts rewritten, foreign concessions revoked, budgets balanced not by aid, but by gold. Within 12 months, Burkina Faso had renegotiated over $3.7 billion in mining deals. Hospitals reopened, schools found their rhythm again, and farmers, long buried under drought and debt, returned to their fields with hope instead of hesitation. It wasn't a miracle. It was reclamation. Piece by piece, the country was buying back its own soul. But far from the Sahel, the story sounded very different. In Paris, in Washington, in London, newsrooms labeled him dangerous, unpredictable, authoritarian. Markets dipped. Aid was frozen. Think tanks called it a warning sign for democracy. Yet the people of Burkina Faso looked around and saw their children back in classrooms, their crops in bloom, their clinics no longer begging for foreign medicine. The word dictator didn't fit what they could see. They called him something else, a man who had reminded them how to stand. Then came June 28th, a day when history bent quietly but permanently. Inside the grand marble hall of the presidential palace, 10 nations gathered beneath a single banner, not of defiance, but of dignity. The air was thick with anticipation. Every seat filled by diplomats, soldiers, and community leaders. At exactly 10 in the morning, the anthem began. And as its final notes faded, 10 ambassadors stepped forward, one by one, and signed the recognition accord, a document affirming Ibrahim Traoré as the legitimate president of Burkina Faso. Outside, the streets roared with celebration. Children waved small flags painted in handmade colors. Women ululated until their voices cracked. Men held placards that read, "We don't need permission to exist." Inside, Traoré spoke softly. "For too long," he said, "we've been told that recognition comes from outside. But today, recognition rises from within." Applause erupted, not from politicians, but from the people. Those who had waited their whole lives to see Africa define itself without permission. And while music filled the streets, screens flickered to life across the world. In trading rooms, men in suits stared at numbers shifting red. $2.3 billion in suspended mineral deals, hung in uncertainty. Aid programs were paused. Western analysts debated if this was sovereignty or suicide. But in the quiet corners of Africa, a phrase began to form: micro-sovereignty. It meant local control, local vision, local destiny. It was not rebellion, it was recovery. Soon, markets adjusted. Gold prices rose. Regional trade between African nations increased by billions. And still, the young leader from Burkina Faso stood calm in the storm he had created. Because to him, this was never about defying the West. It was about healing the wounds left by its shadow. When sanctions came, new hands extended in their place. From the north, Algeria offered security expertise. From the east, Rwanda sent police, trainers, and cyber defense engineers. From across the ocean, Venezuela exchanged oil for gold. Cuba dispatched doctors. Iran shipped refinery equipment. Russia signed a $480 million deal for nuclear power. And China, a $1.2 billion partnership for fiber networks and satellites. The West called it strategic manipulation. Africa called it strategic balance. Together, these nations formed a quiet alliance. The Sahel Security Compact, a network of defense, trade, and technology built on independence, not instruction. But Traoré's most dangerous weapon wasn't military might or political influence. It was an idea that democracy without sovereignty is hollow. He once said, "Without freedom, elections mean nothing." And in that single sentence, he flipped the old equation on its head. For the West, democracy comes first. Ballots, constitutions, observers, aid. For Traoré, it was the opposite. First sovereignty, then democracy. Because what good is a vote if the nation casting it still asks permission to spend its own money? Under his model, Burkina Faso nationalized key industries, redirected over $1.1 billion into education and healthcare, and raised agricultural independence by 22%. They fed themselves, and a nation that feeds itself, he said, can vote for itself. To Western commentators, it was radical. To African thinkers, it was revelation. By now, murals of Traoré appeared beside Thomas Sankara, Patrice Lumumba, and Kwame Nkrumah. Leaders once condemned as radicals, now remembered as prophets. The line between rebellion and rebirth blurred. Students painted slogans across walls. Freedom does not need a certificate. This movement spread far beyond borders. It reached the streets of Nairobi, the markets of Accra, the classrooms of Harare. And suddenly, the conversation had shifted from survival to sovereignty. In universities, young Africans debated, can democracy survive without economic freedom? Can freedom exist when it's still financed by loans? The questions grew louder, and for once, the answers weren't coming from Washington. They were coming from Ouagadougou. Still, the pressure grew. Sanctions deepened. Foreign media called him autocrat, dictator, nationalist. They warned of collapse. But the numbers told a different story. GDP up 4.9%, unemployment down 7%. Exports at their highest in a decade. A silent defiance written not in speeches, but in statistics. And as news anchors debated his legitimacy, his people built schools, refineries, and solar fields. Each brick, each seed, each watt of electricity became a quiet vote of confidence. Proof that sovereignty was not chaos. It was competence. The revolution was no longer political. It had become cultural, even spiritual. In classrooms, children began to recite new lessons. Our resources belong to our people. In the markets, traders counted profits from local cooperatives no longer owned by outsiders. And in the evening, when the red light of the Sahel settled over the rooftops, families gathered to speak of the future, not with fear, but with pride. They knew challenges would come. They knew the old powers would not surrender easily, but they also knew that something irreversible had begun. a psychological liberation. As the world shifted toward a new order, a quiet question began to haunt policymakers everywhere. What happens when the global South decides to trade only with itself? Within 6 months, African gold reserves rose 12%. Western export dependency fell 18%. Burkina Faso's alliances deepened with Mali, Niger, and Guinea. Nations once punished for seeking independence, now united under a shared promise. An attack on one is an attack on all. In less than 2 years, they generated over $3.6 billion in inter-African trade, bypassing Western currencies entirely. Freedom was no longer theory. It had become transaction. And across oceans, a different kind of solidarity emerged. Venezuela, Iran, Bolivia, Cuba, nations that had once lived through isolation, now sending delegations to Ouagadougou. Their message simple: we know what it means to resist. As night falls over the Sahel, the lights of new refineries and schools glow softly against the horizon. In that faint orange dust, you can almost feel the hum of change. A quiet, unstoppable momentum, built not on charity, but on self-belief. The maps on television screens are redrawn, the headlines rewritten, the centers of power rearranged. And somewhere in that quiet, one truth becomes undeniable. Africa is no longer waiting to be invited to the table. It is building its own. The old world looks on with unease. They ask whether this young leader is dangerous. But perhaps what they truly fear is not a man, but a continent finally awake. Because if Burkina Faso can rise without permission, what excuse does the rest of the world have for staying silent? So tonight, as the dust of the Sahel drifts across the horizon and the sound of drums echoes through villages and cities alike, the story of Ibrahim Traoré becomes something greater. A mirror held up to every nation that has ever been told to wait for freedom. The West may call it rebellion, but for millions across Africa, it is simply recovery. A return to ownership, to pride, to voice. And as the red earth of Burkina Faso glows under the fading sun, one question lingers in the air like a heartbeat. If legitimacy can be rewritten by those who refuse to be owned, what happens when an entire continent decides to recognize itself? The world is watching. Africa is awakening. And history, for the first time in a long time, is being written not in silence, but in its own voice.